Now we're going to start the session in honor of the 90 years of Keynes general theory. But before we start, I want to make an announcement. And the celebration of the 90 years of Keynes theory by the political economy group of our department doesn't stop here at Sumapalooza. As you may have noticed this year, the Italian intensity of this conference has been rather low. Normally we have more Italians. So in order to remedy this, in August, on the 19th, 21st, and 26th, we'll have at our institute Aldo Barba, who gently offered himself to compensate, to increase the Italian intensity of the celebrations. Aldo Barba from the University of Napoli is coming to give lectures. He called them Fiscal Policy and Public Debt in a Demand-Led Perspective. It's a sort of a course of lectures. In 3 days, he will present alone. In the last day, there will be a big debate that he invited us to debate with him in the last day. It will be Wednesday 19th, Friday 21, at 2 p.m. at the university. We will divulge this later, but it's good that you copy in your agendas and also book the flights to Brazil, of course, to watch. And then 26 will last longer because there will be his presentation, then an interval, and then the debate with the locals. It's called Fiscal Policy and Public Debt in a Demand-Led Perspective. Okay. Now, turning to our session, we'll have the presentations of Esteban, who I was asking for the date because I said, who recently wrote a book about Harrod, but it's not that recent, it's 2019. And he will talk about Harrod and the correspondence with Keynes, so he's uniquely qualified to do that. And then we'll have Matias Vernengo, who is the only one here that's a proper social philosopher, that will talk about Keynes' social philosophy. It makes sense. And finally, last but not least, Heinz Kurz, who is the historian of economic thought that we all read and admire. So thank you very much for being here. So, Esteban, please.
I'm going to be presenting about Roy Harrod as a critical reader of Keynes' general theory. This is a paper on history of economic thought. I'm not going to discuss Harrod's dynamic theory. As you well know, Harrod was critical of Keynes because he thought Keynes' theory was very static, and he called him the father of, static theory and so on. I'm going to be talking about the correspondence between Harrod and Keynes on the drafts of the general theory before the general theory went into publication. As you know, in the preface to the general theory, Keynes thanks Richard Kahn for constant advice and support, and then he cites John Robinson, Ralph Hawtrey, and Harrod as the 3 other economists besides Richard Kahn that got from Keynes the galley proofs of the general theory. So Keynes had 4 readers, and this is one of them. And the interesting thing from my point of view of Harrod's correspondence and criticism with Keynes, which encompasses obviously the general theory, but it goes further to Harrod's trade cycle book and his essays on economic dynamics and the clearing union, what's published, what's unpublished. Regarding the general theory is that from my point of view, when I read the correspondence, it really clarified, in my mind, the main message of the general theory. And it's clarified it in simple terms. And I think it also clarified the main message in Keynes' own mind. That's one reason why it's important, I think, to read the correspondence. Another reason it's the relationship between positive and negative critique, and this has to do with heterodox economics. Part of heterodox economics is to say what's wrong with the model. Let's say, referring, for example, to chapter 2 of Mill's on liberty, when he talks about negative logic. And once we have the negative critique, we have the positive critique. What do you have to offer? And what is the relationship between the negative and positive critique? And Keynes thought that both of these were completely related, could not be divorced. And that when you were very critical of your opponent and you provided a positive theory, you could not just present your positive theory. You had to present also your negative criticism independently of how harsh that criticism was. And this has to do with the third reason why it's important to read the correspondence, and it's how do we communicate with others that don't have the same beliefs. How, for example, as a heterodox economist, we communicate with orthodox economists. I'd like to start first by talking about the context, the intellectual collaboration and friendship between Keynes and Harrod, which spanned from 1922, when Walter Runciman, who is a prominent member of the Liberal Party, should introduce Harrod to Keynes. And as a result, Harrod visited Keynes in Cambridge. The letter, they're unpublished. They're in a Japanese archive, but there are 2-3 letters where you can get this, how Runciman introduced Keynes, how Keynes invited Harrod, and so on. And when Harrod met Keynes, it was love at first sight for both. Harrod talks about the excitement being almost unbearable. I must undoubtedly come to Cambridge. That was the only place where they were saying anything useful about economics. And Keynes really liked Harrod. And this led to a lengthy and sometimes very confusing exchanges between both. If you read the exchange on the essay, and even sometimes on the trade cycle, you can read it over and over and over again, and the conclusion is, what the hell are they talking about? And he goes on. And to try to make sense, when I was writing the book of this, it was really sort of a nightmare. Some other contributions. The main contributions of Harrod is the Cambridge Handbook series, 1927, which is a second Cambridge Handbook. The first one was written by Henderson, and it's the early version, what I call the early version of Samuelson's Introduction to Economics, Supply and Demand, which had 5 different editions. The 5th one is basically impossible to obtain, but supposedly there's a 5th edition. Harrod's Trade Cycle, obviously, and the essay on dynamic theory. From my perspective, Harrod's Cambridge Economics Handbook, especially the later editions after he introduced the principle of effective demand in the 1939 edition, they're really, really useful. He goes into not only trade, interest rates, and so on. And the one I like the most is Harrod's Trade Cycle. And I put here the essay on dynamic theory, but the essay that's really interesting on dynamics by Harrod is actually the draft essay that never got published in 1938 as a result of Keynes. Because Keynes told him it's too long. But that's where he explains much more, and it's much clearer than the 1939 essay, especially on the endogeneity of the warranted rate of growth. And then obviously there are the clearing union proposals that span from 1941 to 1946. They're in the volume 25. Also, I put volume 13, 14, should put volume 25 of Keynes' collected works. So that's about the clearing union, and some in volume 26, and also in the unpublished correspondence. And if you read the unpublished correspondence, and I will get back to that later, Harrod was much more ambitious than Keynes in the clearing union proposal, and he was very adamant in including developing countries in the clearing union proposal, in terms of having, for example, nutrition, in terms of having welfare, and so on. And they had obviously a mutual influence. In 1935, early 1935, Keynes sent galley proofs to Harrod, Hawtrey, Richard Kahn, and John Robinson. Richard Kahn and John Robinson had already criticized the treaties, and that's in volume 29, when they talked about when they came up with this thing of the manifesto, which came up with the idea of, and Hawtrey too, about variations in income. And this is what, in June 1935, when Keynes said, the galley proof, this is what the general theory of employment, interest, and money looked like. So you accept this definitions and ideas, which was much broader, much broader. And thanks to Harrod, Keynes was able to summarize and shorten that part. The character, the first thing that comes out of the correspondence is that Keynes was really able to point out what was a novelty in the general theory. And this quote is from a letter to Harrod, 30th of August, 1936, when he made comments on Harrod's paper, Mr. Keynes and Traditional Theory, which were jointly presented with the paper by Hicks and the paper by Mead. And those three papers, the one by Hicks is the one mostly used. Mead is very interesting because it has expectations. And when he made the comments to Harrod, it says, you do not mention effective demand. And he says, to me, the most extraordinary thing regarded historically is the complete disappearance of the theory of demand and output as a whole, after it had been for a quarter of a century the most discussed thing in economics. So if you read, for example, volume 10, when he talks about Malthus, that's what he says about Malthus in his essays in biography. And one of the most important transitions for me was suddenly realizing the psychological law that when income increases, the gap between income and consumption will increase. And then later came the notion of interest as a measure of liquidity preference, and what put everything together, the marginal efficiency. He says, after many drafts and an immense amount of modeling. So he came up with the theory of effective demand here, consumption, investment, and so on, the typical figure that's not in the general theory, but that's in every textbook, then liquidity preference, and then the third thing that joined everything together, which was the marginal efficiency and its relation to the money rate of interest that's defined by liquidity preference and money supply. So the idea of Keynes and how he came up with the general theory was obviously sequential. And that's the way it's supposed to be presented, I think. First of all, the correspondence, besides pinpointing what was Keynes' essential contribution, it clarified a couple of things. The first is the structure and causality of the general theory. And this is the way Harrod put it in a letter to Keynes on 30th August 1935. Your view, as I understand, is this: the volume of investment is determined by the marginal efficiency of capital schedule, the rate of interest determined by liquidity preference schedule, quantity of money, volume of employment determined by volume of investment multiplier, value of multiplier determined by the propensity to save. And Keynes said it could not be stated better than on the first page of the letter, his theory. The third thing that the correspondence did is the clarification between the first part of the general theory when he talks about the classical theory of employment and the latter part where he talks about interest. And he really made a distinction, like he says in this quote, between the classical theory of employment, which does make perfect sense and works all right on certain special assumptions, and the classical theory of the rate of interest. So he thought that the classical theory of employment could be made feasible on the assumption of full employment, the equality between the marginal disutility of labor and the real wage. But he said no possible reconciliation could occur for the rate of interest. It is nonsense to assume, he said at the same time, that income is constant and that the investment schedule and the propensity to save are variable. So he made really a statement regarding these two theories. And this is why Keynes actually never rejected, he may have rejected the labor supply curve, but maintained the labor demand curve. And this is the clarification of the critique of the classical rate of interest. The only figure actually that appears in the general theory comes out of the correspondence between Harrod and Keynes. This is the way the figure that you have on page 180 of chapter 14 appears. This is the way it's in the general theory. It's exactly the same. And from my point of view, it's much better explained in the collected works than in the general theory. And he came up with a note by Harrod on the letter on page 557, and Keynes interpreted that note with this diagram, and he pointed out with an investment schedule and the amount saved of a given level of income to various levels of the rate of interest, and how one curve was dependent on the other, so that, for example, if the investment demand schedule vary, you couldn't really determine the rate of interest because the savings schedule would change. You would have to assume necessarily that the marginal efficiency of capital did not change. How did Keynes want to present his achievement? And he wanted to rock the boat. And he said, I expect a great deal of what I write to be water off a duck's back. I am certain that it would be water off a duck's back unless I am sufficiently strong in my criticism to force the classicals to make rejoinders. I want, so to speak, to raise a dust, because it is only out of controversy that will arise what I am saying will be understood. And so he thought that the two things is harsh criticism, and I'm going to give some examples, and that became eventually personal, and his positive critique were completely united, could not be divorced. If my constructive sections are correct, my critical sections are more than justified. And this can explain the derogatory remarks you find in the general theory to certain issues, and even to some economists. You can find several, one or two, allusion to pseudo-mathematics. Ignoratio elenchi appears more than one time in the general theory, and this idea about the wild duck, about how the wild duck has dived down to the bottom and bitten fast of all the rubbish that is down there, and it would take an extraordinary clever dog to dive after and fish her up again. And Robertson took this as a personal criticism and was really, really offended. And the clever dog, I think, was Keynes. Yes, extraordinary clever dog. And this is an allusion to Henrik Ibsen's Wild Duck. Now, I would assume that when Keynes came up with this, they knew what the Wild Duck was about. The Wild Duck, the play, was about people that live in a household that think that they live in a completely unreal world. And to take an example, there's this old man that used to be a hunter, and he's accompanied by one of the servants, and they go to the third floor of the house, which is full of plants and so on, and he thinks he's hunting in a forest. And that's the wild duck, and that's what these neoclassical classical economists are. That they think that they are in a world that has no correspondence with the real world. And Harrod's response was that the provocative tone is mistaken. And I think it was a consensus at that time. And Richard Kahn, in one of these papers on the general theory, that's what he says, that it was a mistake. And his argument for a mistake, he says, what I fear is that the less well-placed readers may not understand so much, that the dust you want to raise will obscure the view of your central point. If the economists who read your book don't take the essential point, the outlook is bad. There's a limit to what the human mind can assimilate. Most of the readers won't have the time or opportunity to assimilate powers of grasping the points raised in subsequent controversies. I suggest that the tactics are mistaken. And then he told them how to put his critique. He says, it is doing great violence to their fundamental ground of thought if you tell them that two independent demand and supply functions won't jointly determine price and quantity. We can think if this applies to the way the capital critique was framed also. And he says, tell them that there will be more than one solution. Tell them that we don't know the supply function. Tell them that the ceteris paribus is inadmissible, but don't impugn the analysis itself. Don't say that it's nonsense, as Keynes said on more than one occasion. And I would like to finish with this, with the Keynes influence of Harrod on Harrod, and how Harrod went beyond Keynes in some of his writings. He incorporated the principle of effective demand in 1939 edition of International Economics. He introduced a static foreign trade multiplier, but was never capable of putting together a dynamic trade multiplier with his dynamic theory. He was never able to do this. And in the later editions of International Economics, you would find hints at an open economy dynamic theory, but only hints and only sort of some prose, but never a full developed. He was never able to develop a model. It was Thirlwell that eventually developed the dynamic trade multiplier, not in a way akin to that would square with Harrod's views, but anyway, it was dynamic. And then also the reform of the international financial and real architecture, and I put here financial and real architecture because Harrod had a lot of influence on Keynes on bringing in a board to control commodity prices, an investment board, capital controls, even though sometimes initially Harrod was not really in favor of that, welfare issues, and also, as I said before, bringing in the developing economies. And one last thing that Harrod did that it's not in Keynes and that John Robinson criticized the general theory is the absence of composition. When we talk, for example, about economic development, we can't talk just about aggregates. We have to talk about composition. And he brought in eventually in other writings, the shortage of know-how, rather the shortage of capital as the key to development, the import of foreign capital tied to the availability of know-how, and to establish a national bank by a levy placed on foreign capital, a very small one, but that in his view would be sufficient to fund the initial capital base of a national development bank. And there's a statement in the Theory of Economic Dynamics in 1973 where he says if foreign capital enter the country and they will not share their know-how or they will not use local production, just say no. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Esteban. Now I call the great, the only one, Matias Vernengo, our favorite American economist. We'll talk about Harrod. No, about the philosophical issues.
Well, it's not really a philosophical issue, it's the social policy. Chapter 24 of the general class. It is called a social philosophy. He called that. So, first of all, it's okay? No? I don't know. Oh, okay. You know, you're waving, I'm waiting. And I assume this is working. Yes, it is working. So, it's before I even start this, it has a strange genealogy of how I ended up talking about this stuff. I had no plan of discuss whether Keynes was socialist or not, or you know, what are the implications of whether he is or not for his social policy, which is really, you know, his policies. That's what he's talking about, the social philosophy of the general theory. And I think that you know, Heinz asked me, are you going to talk about the famous paper on the grandchildren? And it's not. It's about the general theory because it's where his real, you know, contribution and where Keynes becomes Keynes. That's the relevant sort of differential specific about him. So it's about that chapter. And what happened is I've been for, as I told you yesterday, for a few years, the book editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics. And I have a strategy that I'll confess here. I write little blog posts about books that I've just read in order to eventually use them as a book review and have a summary of what I thought about the book, because I forget what I read. I'm in the, you know, senior phase of my life, and with that I remember what are the main points of the book. And I read a book by Jim Crotty, and Jim Crotty is a scholar that I respect a lot and like to read. And he was a professor at Bucknell University, where I am now, early in his career. And he wrote a book in which he essentially, you know, says that Keynes was a socialist, and that gets to an old debate by O'Donnell and Skidelsky and whatnot, and whether he was a liberal, Skidelsky, or he was a socialist, which is what more or less O'Donnell sort of. And I think there is not much of a debate. You know, as much as I like O'Donnell and I like Crotty, I think it's very clear that Keynes was a liberal. So that's you know, and a particular kind of liberal. So I'm going to briefly talk about that, but you know, one thing led to another. It's the 90 years. The History of Economic Society had a roundtable, you know, discussion of this, and I thought, well, I already did the other paper, which, by the way, is coming in a book of essays in honor of Tom. Tom had written a little bit on why Keynes has a view of you know, of this, you know, the social relations that exclude class conflict, and which I think is absolutely correct. And it appeared, you know, on the series, the German FNM sort of paper. So my paper came in that series too, and it's coming in a book of essays in honor of Tom Paley. So that which edited with Esteban and should come out next year. So. You know, what I did is I talked a little bit about this idea of what's in chapter 24. So what I'm going to do this is essentially a variation of, so I had sent the paper. So some people have the paper. It's a variation of that presentation in which I talk a little bit about this stuff I talked in the other paper, and then move on to, you know, discuss chapter 24 and its connection with those things. I should say although I don't emphasize it as much as I should, the book to read on this in many ways, because it's where Keynes, you know, views on politics are discussed, not centrally, but it's his tangent to that discussion. It's a book written by Peter Clark, who is a historian, not a historian of economic thought. And he wrote a very good book on the Keynesian Revolution, I should say. It's the Keynesian Revolution in the Making. This is a previous book that he wrote in the 70s on a group of people that refer to themselves as new liberals, not neoliberals, new liberals. And and that essentially are precursors of Keynes. The title of the book is Liberals and Social Democrats. I'm kind of disagreeing here and saying they're liberals, but not quite yet social democrats. Keynes wasn't a social democrat. The point of the paper, of the first one, is that eventually socialists become Keynesian. So it's in reverse. People, tend to confuse, I think, that sort of stuff, including Peter Clark. I highly recommend the book, by the way. So, and I should say, it's in many ways not a paper of history of ideas. It's an essay. I call it all the time, this essay, because I'm not doing papers these on history of ideas. I have to look at the archive, really, and all of those things, and my interpretation of things on the basis of some article. Well, no, I think that somebody may say some of this might be controversial. I tend to think that nothing I said here is particularly controversial. So, but Keynes it's peculiar because you have this topic is one of the interesting things that I found right in this paper, the first paper actually. This paper less so because I haven't sent it around for publication. But the first paper is that you encounter two views on Keynes. Keynes was either from the left. He was somebody trying to save capitalism from itself, and sometimes even defined as a conservative. Which is a peculiar thing. Keynes was definitely not a conservative, trying to preserve the system. He was a reformist. He wanted to change the system, very much so. And on the other hand, you have from the right, a very strong notion that he was some sort of radical socialist, bent on turning up the system upside down, which again doesn't make much sense. The Cambridge Journal of Economics actually published a paper that says that Keynes proves that the guy in a footnote is an Austrian economist, but not Heinz is in Austria, but not an Austrian economist, that says that Keynes was a socialist because he attended a lecture by Bernard Shaw. Bernard Shaw is adjacent at this group of, some of the new liberals were in the Fabian Society, but then they left and they have a complicated relation with the Fabian Society. I'm going to talk a little bit about that very briefly. And Keynes writes to a friend that last night we saw a talk by George Bernard Shaw, and he convinced us that we're all socialists, and that's the basis to say that Keynes is a socialist. So and I also want to quote this. The first paper I actually sent to the Cambridge Journal, and I was told that I didn't understand anything of Keynes because I didn't read the Sexual Diaries, which I must confess I did not read Keynes' Sexual Diaries. So that's a major flaw in my work. By the way, the Sexual Diaries are from way before the general theory and all of that. So for what's worth. And I do not claim to know whether Keynes and Harrod fell in love at first sight. So it's one of the things I do not know, and I don't have archival research done on that. So Keynes, the point is on policy. On policy, Keynes was further ahead. The relationship of his politics and economics is complicated. Part of what I said in his first, I'm not going to follow this very closely, but part of what I said in the first paper is that Keynes' politics and his policies were more radical early on than his economics. His economics at the beginning is still very conventional, Marshallian, and so on and so forth. So, and there is an evolution from the 20s to the 30s. This was a discussion also very much influenced by Jim Crotty, because Crotty makes a whole point of how in the 20s, Keynes and those changes already are somewhat radical on a theoretical level, and he's moving away. So, this keeps coming back and forth. The new so I think I have it at some point. Keynes and neoliberalism. So the new liberals are this group of people that are associated with Asquith. Asquith was first, in 1906, Labour has this landslide election, and they come back. Asquith is first the Chancellor of the Exchequer. When the Prime Minister passes away, he becomes the Prime Minister. There is a famous budget at that point. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is David Lloyd George, and the budget of 1909, which introduces social reforms like pensions for the elderly and whatnot, is considered the beginning of if you want now, they call it social democracy in England. And but they were new liberals, and the group of people are this group that are associated particularly. I highlight because I think they're the two relevant and the two that Keynes actually on an intellectual level respected the most. Politically, Keynes really liked Hobsbawm and Hobson. which he cites in the general theory. He interacts with him. He's one of the heretics, and so on and so forth. Those are two typical members of the new liberal group. They had interactions with the group of people at the Fabian Society. They were not Fabian. They were not socialists. They were new liberals. So that's the sort of thing. They were reformists. They believed that you have to preserve the old classical idea of liberalism in the Smithian sense of liberty, individual liberty, some degree of equity, and civilization. If I think I'm citing Professor Kurz correctly on the things that brought up about Adam Smith. So this liberalism doesn't require a minimalist state, as the old classical sort of liberalism didn't. So it is, in a sense, classical liberalism. And public action is obviously necessary for all of this. Keynes remained in many ways, in modern parlance, to the left of the Labour Party. So Philip Snowden was the Chancellor of the Exchequer of Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister. And they were staunch fiscal conservatives, and Keynes certainly wasn't. So that's part of the thing to understand. By the 20s, Keynes abandoned, along the 20s, he goes discarding all of the relevant, the triad of orthodoxy in policy. So the gold standard, free trade, and the idea that balanced budget, some Gladstonian sound fiscal policy is necessary. He abandoned all of those. So he's an orthodox in policy, but he defends all of these things on the basis of Marshallian theory. There is no significant change in theory. The 1930 book, which was supposed to be his conclusive book, is the book that Schumpeter likes a lot. It's his favorite Keynes book. It's Wickselian. It's not particularly radical in theory. He even gets Richard Kahn to go and translate interest and prices, and they knew they have to translate the elements that it was necessary to engage with Wickselian theory, and he's essentially engaging with that. So it's Marshallian economics encounters, Wickselian economics. It's essentially that, and so there is I think there is no argument that by 1930 Keynes still remains absolutely orthodox. It's well established. So that's why I said I'm not saying anything, particularly complicated here. And it's documented when he changes his mind. It's 1932. It's even there is a famous paper by Mario Milgate showing that actually it's it's Pigou, of all people, that points out that his equations don't have variation in the level of income, and there is a problem, and so on and so forth. And then it's in the debates with the kids in the circus, kids for him, that the changes happen. And so that's the story. So then comes the theoretical revolution. I'm going to jump a little bit because otherwise I'll be I'm already talking too much, and somebody will say, Matias, shut up. So the important thing for me is here. So what I told you is Keynes is essentially a classical liberal. And I'm going to come back because part of my story is in this paper is try to suggest that there is a group of people that are correctly called neoliberals. And I'm going to come to, that's another debate I had with Miroski, which is the authority on neoliberalism he wrote the entry on the Palgrave on neoliberalism. I don't know who's the idiot that asked him to do that. But the point is that there is a group of people, neoliberals, that claim to be, they don't like the term neoliberalism. Miroski is very right on that. They avoid talking about the name that they use, and they try to refer to themselves as classical liberals. What I'm going to try to say here is that the new liberalism of Keynes makes him a classical liberal, closer to Adam Smith than Hayek or Friedman in many ways. And that neoliberals are something different. And I'm going to try to pinpoint exactly where that is in my view, if we use a reconstruction of history of thought, but not necessarily. So it is in that sense, like you did, it's analytical in that sense, going back, but not archival and looking at those things. So Keynes is saying something important when he ditches says law. He's suggesting that the system is not harmoniously self-adjusted towards full employment. And that's something that it's certainly part of the Marshallian, Wickselian sort of tradition. And he's sort of breaking with that imperfectly. So I'm not going to try to tell you that he completed that criticism. So it's imperfect, but it's very clear that it's there. That makes his program long-term. He's saying that in the long run, when prices and wages are flexible and all of that, the system, the economic system, is stable. That's another thing that is very impressive to me. How everybody says Keynes thought about the instability of capitalism. Yes, but the instability is political, because you have economic stability at a low level of employment that generates social and political instability that may lead to fascism and socialism and so on and so forth. So in order to discuss that distinction, where does he come in terms of the classical liberalism and eventually neoliberalism, I do it, and I did it rather than using more directly classical, neoclassical surplus approach versus marginalism, you can think of a broader sort of tradition. So when I teach history of ideas to students at Bucknell, I break it from Bentham on one side and the utilitarian rationalist tradition, and on the other side, the conflict tradition. And I think that that's easier to understand for kids of how, and Adam Smith is in the conflict tradition, very much as, Petty, Ricardo, Keynes, Marx. And Keynes is not. So Keynes, as I say here, Keynes doesn't fit neatly in any of these two categories. He was trained clearly in the second tradition. So he was trained by utilitarian, rational, scholars. So Marshall, Pigou are definitely in that tradition. However, his breakup with the Say's law surprisingly brings him closer to the first tradition. So I'm not saying he's a classical political economy. He wasn't. We wish. So I'm going to suggest in the paper, I do suggest that's where Sraffa and Kaletsky become relevant, because they bring the Keynesian revolution that is breaking with this essential thing of the rationalist utilitarian sort of tradition to the world of classical political economy. So those are the guys that bring it really to that tradition. Keynes is incomplete, but it's central in making that transition. That's the relevance of Keynes. And that will be the relevance to understand his social policies in chapter 24, which I think he changes some of his views, surprisingly, on some of this. So I'm going to jump because I already more or less told you that. So what I said, he doesn't reconstruct the theory of value distribution. He retained marginalist concepts. Esteban was talking about here the marginal efficiency of capital. There is, again, no denying. He tells you in the general theory, in so many words, it is the same concept as Irving Fisher. So, I mean, it's more clear than that. I don't know how can it be more clear than that. Yes. So he's telling you it's neoclassical theory. And it has the implications that it has. He has a natural rate, even though he wants to get rid. The system would have had a tendency to full employment. He has to appeal to some imperfection and so on and so forth. So all of those things, I think that at this point, it's very hard that we're having still some of these debates. I think that it doesn't mean that you have to throw, the water, the Keynes baby with the water of, of the bath, but it means that it's incomplete what he did. So new liberalism. So here's where it's a complicated thing. So what I'm suggesting to you guys is the following thing. In some sense, and I don't know exactly where I have, and I'm probably running out of time, so I don't want to. Let me see if I find where I said that. Yes, before I go there, so there is a concern of how you define some of the breaks of Keynes with the marginalist tradition in economics and his political movement. And what I told you is that Keynes is only radical theoretically at this point, but his politics, I should say, is very moderate. So he never moves, in part because labor was, too conservative for him, and he was never a conservative. So he remains in this sort of place that, it's sort of forgotten and whatnot. But he's also, his fear is a fear of what? Both of fascism, I should say many conservatives associate him with, what's the name of the British fascist that was Mosley, thank you. With Mosley, he rejects Mosley as soon as Mosley becomes a sort of proto or openly fascist. And he certainly hated the Soviet system. So in part, I'm using his understanding of socialism, because I'm going to tell, yes, of course, if you read socialism from modern lens, yes, a lot of the Keynesian policies could be seen as socialist. But the socialism of his time is managed economy and something, that requires a different arrangements in terms of property. So private property would be significantly limited. And Keynes hated both ideas, the idea that you should not have private property and private initiative. In chapter 24, he goes at length on saying how this would require still the individual entrepreneurial activities. If you want to call it Schumpeterian, it's fine. He keeps that because he thinks that that's an important part. And in that sense, he doesn't think he's moving towards socialism. And so I'm suggesting, yes, that's the definition, and he certainly is not. But here we enter the issue, I think, of how we're going to deal with the difference between neoliberal and the neoliberals. And here I read long ago, and I use this idea of Isaiah Berlin. So Isaiah Berlin famously, who was a teacher, I should say, of Wynne Godley. And Wynne used to say that his two favorite teachers at Oxford were Isaiah Berlin and Andrews, the guy of full cost pricing. So not surprised there. So he defines between positive liberty and negative liberty. A typical thing in these discussions, particularly Austrian conservative economists in the United States, is to suggest that Isaiah Berlin sees positive liberty as very negative. It's authoritarian. So negative liberty is you're not coerced to do anything, and that's it. So free from coercion. Positive liberty is the idea that you can express fully all of your potential. And to some extent, that implies perhaps limiting some of the coercion on individual behavior. So there is this notion that there is an authoritarian, I should have put in here, authoritarian in the Isaiah Berlin sort of thing. I'm more careful in the paper than on the PowerPoint, so I apologize. But my point is that you don't have actually to abandon negative liberty to believe in Keynes' ideas. Keynes is saying simply that if you want to have a system in which you don't end up in a situation in which you have Stalinism or fascism, because the system will put, it will be, the economic system is stable, but at a very low level of employment, perhaps, like it was during the Depression. With unemployment, you'll have that people will be amenable to eliminating your negative liberties, coercion, so that democracy fails here because the capitalist system does not work. Contrary to Schumpeter in that respect, because Schumpeter in Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy is the system fails, capitalism collapses because it does work well, and it creates sort of elements that move it away. So in that respect, Keynes is different, I should say, than in his view, and he's an optimist, contrary to Schumpeter. Schumpeter is a pessimist, I think. I'm giving material to Professor Kurz to criticize me. Keynes is an optimist. Keynes is an optimist in the sense that he thinks it's viable to save capitalism from itself. But what Keynes does is he reverses the logic of if we go to the original title of the paper, which we changed, which is Economic and Political Liberty. The neoliberal thing, and it's first chapter of I should say Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, and it's there also in The Road to Serfdom in Hayek. The notion is that political liberty requires first economic liberty. The notion is that because the market is the only mechanism that creates harmony, it's necessary for solving political problems. Keynes reverses that, although he's not dialoguing with them because he's writing, in a sense, before them. But what Keynes is saying is that it's exact opposite. What you need is political liberalism first, even when that requires the preservation of some market and property freedoms. So Keynes is reversing the logic of the liberties associated to neoliberalism. And that's possible in many ways, I'm telling you, because he has this notion that the markets do not produce a harmonious result that goes to full employment. So that's the reason why it's okay to sort of intervene in those cases. So that's essentially the sort of part of that. Let me jump to just a little bit. Well, there is a brief thing here that I say. So it's surprising that it's the neoliberals that claim that they are the followers of classical liberalism. In many ways, they're subverting the ideas of classical liberalism. Classical liberals, so I always say that if you, in my definition of neoliberalism is the intersection of two groups. First of all, there are people that claim that they're for laissez-faire policies, and they claim the mantle of these laissez-faire policies from classical liberals. That's where they take their, so rhetorically, they use classical liberalism. And then they tag onto this, the justification for this, on the basis of markets are efficient in some sort of sense, okay, harmonious. There are many different ways. I tend to suggest not every neoclassical economist is a neoliberal. Most of them probably are not. The important thing is that most of the economists that are neoclassical and are not neoliberals are on the basis of some market imperfection. And Keynes was that until he wasn't, because he's tried to say no. And so Keynes actually is moving, that's what I say, he's moving in the direction of this other group that, you know, may or may not be, in the case of Keynes, not for laissez-faire policies, but also because they don't believe that markets, you know, sort of are efficient. I should say my debate with Mirowski is, it's somewhat based on the notion that he says that neoliberalism is a movement, not just about economics, broader than economics. And so you cannot say that the way I define it, all neoliberals are neoclassical. And he says, well, there are many people that are not neoclassical, they don't even know what it is, and they are, you know, neoliberals. So my final response to him is, well, they're like, what's the name of the character in Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme that he speaks in prose but forgets, you know, doesn't know that he speaks in prose. So all of those, Monsieur Jordan, somebody said it. Or, yes, yes, Candide? Oh, I thought it was Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. I think, well, whatever. It's somewhere there to you know. But the point is, what I'm saying is, you don't have to be a neoclassical economist to believe that markets are harmonious. Many people end up believing that without knowing. So I will support, I maintain my position, you know, contra Mirowski, that I think it's central to be neoclassical, to be marginal. The economic foundation of neoclassicism, of neoliberalism, Monsieur Jordan. Yes, no, I said the name. We just have a controversy on in what book, but okay, well, fair enough. It's okay, people. It doesn't matter. You got my point. My point was, yes, yes. We have good information that it was Clarice Lispector, this unrecognized Brazilian author. So, and I should be shutting up soon. So I'm gonna jump to the end. So the social liberalism of the general theory. So all of the things that are there should be read, you know, very carefully. I briefly talk about some of the stuff that is there. The euthanasia of the rentier, the socialization of investment. What Keynes is envisioning is simply a managed economy. He moves to think, oh, it's simple. We don't need to do all of these things that the socialists want. We can sort of manage the economy, tweak around with macroeconomic tools, and we move the economy where we want, and we avoid the two extremes of political sort of extremism. He changes his view on things. I should say Keynes was early on clearly somewhat neo-Malthusian and an eugenist. By the 1940s, he relaxed. He supports the Beveridge Report. He thinks that, you know, which is essentially saying we should give stuff to the poor, which the early eugenists wouldn't have agreed with. So he moves on. Why? Because all of a sudden, that's not so central, because, you know, markets don't produce this optimal outcome. He moves from, you know, some implications about growth. He had a very, you know, before it's complicated, because growth theory is, you know, savings are necessary for, you know, accumulation and so on and so forth. Now they're not necessarily so. So there are many things. He doesn't, I mean, I want to be careful about this. He doesn't complete any of those things, but he had moved in the direction of those things, and that's visible in his discussions. I would even say further, if you read some of his correspondence with respect to the loans with England and, you know, the United States at the end of his life, he even gets some of the points of development economics. I discovered this beautiful letter where he discusses, it's one thing to get indebted, you know, going here a little bit, you know, contrary to what Jayati said yesterday, that maybe what, you know, you didn't say that. I'm putting words in your mouth. That, yes, well, you're bringing Candide here. So, that you don't need it's one thing to get indebted in pounds, a very different thing to get indebted in dollars. So all of those things are possible exactly because he moved away from this idea of a self-adjusting economy. Thank you very much.
Now, after this deeply philosophical presentation, I invite our dear Professor Heinz Kurz to give us his infinite wisdom for as long as you can stand it. Have fun. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I must say I find myself in a difficult position because people 40 minutes for my talk. What can I do? I mean, he did it in today. Well, there you go. 30, 40. In this perspective, yes, it makes perfect sense. Yes, but nevertheless, I try to do my best not to bore you. That's the important thing. Ah, yes. No. Yeah. The title is, of course, taken from Shakespeare. I mean, the Merchant of Venice. All that glisters is not gold. Often have you heard that told? Not gold, but perhaps mortal. And of course, one has to explain why is a book which is not gold, nevertheless immortal. Well, that is something I will touch upon, and Schumpeter comes in this regard. But the first remark I would like to make, it's not clear whether I really belong here properly, because there was someone, I don't know who it was, I was told, he said that Sraffians should not be ranked amongst the Keynesians or post-Keynesians or whatnot. This I found peculiar because there is a church, it seems, that fills its buildings with the true believers. And you will see in a minute that I'm not a true believer of everything Keynes said, but who would be? It would be completely ridiculous. On the other hand, I mean, clearly enough, Keynes was extremely pleased by Sraffa. He thought very highly of him, and to think that, I mean, one can denounce Sraffa as not belonging, so to speak, to the critical bunch is just, I think, a ridiculous position. I think, and I will try to show this during my talk. So, do I have another thing to say at the beginning? Oh yes, if you ask me for a reference to a single paper that interprets the general theory pretty well, I would say read Garignani. It's a very good paper, and that is in the 70s. And even today, I think it's very worth the while, because he has a broad perspective on economic analysis, and is not a narrow follower of any particular strand. He follows, I mean, Garignani also, I think, coined the phrase that, I mean, there are only two kinds of people, those who know economics and those who don't. And you should hope that you belong to the right ones. So whether post-Keynesian, whether this, whether that, whether whatnot, I mean, good economics is what matters. So that is what I shall try to show you. Now, this is an interesting picture. Franklin sent it to me. He seems to have changed his barber. And this is, of course, on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, that's me. And it was, pardon? Yes, it was on the occasion of that wonderful conference he organized in Salvador de Bahia. And yes, we were all there. We were enjoying it, and it was really a nice conference, and very full also intellectually. So yes, there are means and ways to get along. Contents. The first question is, what makes a work great? I mean, we should be clear about that. We easily, I mean, attribute greatness to certain works. What is it really? some recent views about the channel theory. However, I mean, I will start with Schumpeter. Schumpeter, the one at the time who is close to well, enemy in some sense, rival in other sense. Schumpeter will be the best economist of the world. A ridiculous idea, of course, but he felt that Keynes was perhaps at the best economist in the world. So, I mean, what can he do about all this? Then I will about the important principle of substitution and Keynes, because to understand what Keynes did and why and how, I think we must compare it to the neoclassical basic principle, and that is substitutability. I will focus attention essentially on production, and if there is enough substitutability and prices are flexible, there is no problem. The system will gravitate towards a full employment situation, full stop. So, I mean, what is Keynes saying vis-a-vis this thing, and what are other people saying? Now, there's a little excursus perhaps on the counterfactual reasoning. I mean, all this conference is about counterfactuals. I mean, I was very surprised, and occasionally people are extremely, how should I say, willingly doing all kinds of counterfactual reasonings, and maybe it's a problem. Once again, quoting Gargiani, there is an attitude in economics, and particularly amongst neoclassical economists, to have a kind of push-button economics. You see, you've got your model, and then let's change something a little bit here into the machinery, push the button, and the result comes out. Now, if you look at the people like Keynes or Smith, Ricardo, when they approach problems, what they typically do in the first round, if I may say so, they try to find out what are the most important factors at work. And then I get a picture of what the outcome would be. But then they are clear enough that there are other factors at work as well. And of course, counterfactual reasoning nowadays means you must take into account, so to speak, the entire complex of causes, and not just one. I shall come to that in a minute. Then, is the earth flat or round? That is, of course, a crucial question. And this is a reference to the capital controversy, which culminated in the late 1960s in a Quarterly Journal of Economics discussion, to which contributed, amongst others, Pasanetti, Gargiani, and tutti quanti, where the neoclassicals really had to face a serious defeat. And some people try to play that down nowadays. They made a mathematical mistake, which is true. But what are the implications of it? And the implications of it are, of course, the phenomena of reswitching and reverse capital deepening. And that makes the substitution mechanism break down. If these factors are there, you can't rely on substitution. I mean, you see, Smith already was of the opinion that the commercial society, as he called it, is inherently unstable unless you control the financial sector. I mean, Smith was not that guy who said, behave selfishly and interdependent markets sort things out, everything is fine. No, he pointed out, if the financial sector is not controlled well, it's not just controlled, but controlled well, and that's a very difficult thing. Then, there may be crises, triggered by the financial sectors and carry over to the real economy, and the whole thing will blow up. And he said, if, so to speak, the selfish behavior of a few individuals in those sectors threatens the survival of the entire society, you must do something about it. You cannot just let these things happen. So I will perhaps, if time allows, I will not talk about the rest because I'm sure time does not allow. Okay. Now, what makes a work great? This is interesting. I think John Maynard Keynes' envious rival for the title Best Economist of the World was, of course, Schumpeter at the time. No doubt. By the way, today, references to Schumpeter's work compared to Keynes are much larger. Schumpeter is the hero of our period, and if you even look at the tech giants and their representatives, they all talk about Schumpeter and creative destruction. I mean, that is the story, so to speak, that is going round, and therefore maybe there is a problem with Keynes that he didn't give enough emphasis on technological change in innovations and all that. I mean, Marshall, productivity theory is not a good guide. I mean, I think to understanding what is happening now with the big technological firms. Okay, now what he wrote, Schumpeter, most of the creations of the intellect or fancy pass away for good after a time that varies between an after dinner hour and a generation. Some, however, do not. They suffer eclipses, but they come back again. That's the criterion. And they come back not as unrecognizable elements of a cultural inheritance, but in their individual garb and with their personal scars, which people may see and touch. These we may call the great ones. They cannot die. They recur. The ideas, I mean, are alive. It is no disadvantage of this definition that it links greatness to vitality. But there is an additional advantage of defining greatness by revivals if it thereby becomes independent of our own prejudices or our love and hate. So you will discuss those authors carefully, despite the fact that they are not of your opinion. It's important to expose your views to the views of others, because only then can you sharpen your ideas. And I think this is an interesting thing what Schumpeter had to say, but there are more things he said. We need not believe that the great achievement must necessarily be a source of light or faultless in either fundamental design or details. On the contrary, we may believe it to be a power of darkness. We may think it fundamentally wrong or disagree with it on any number of particular points. However, such adverse judgment or even exact disproof by its very failure to injure fatally only serves to bring out the power of the structure. And I would be almost inclined by exaggerating that greatness is defined in terms of the greatness of the errors committed. I mean, great authors are typically authors which in one way or another made very difficult judgments and were wrong. And the rest of us, the small ones, they then try to correct them or understand them and so on and so forth. I think it's think about Keynes, think about Marx to some extent, think about Schumpeter. Yes, we ordinary economists, we are able to make small errors, and many of them. But some of them make big errors. I mean, they have visions of the world, and they may be totally wrong. Well, at any rate, Schumpeter, interestingly enough, thought very highly of Marx. He singled him out as the most important man in the history of our subject, because he was the only one, maybe that is an exaggeration, who understood that the major characteristic feature of capitalism is its inherent, revolutionary character, continuously revolutionizing the basis of our system, the technology, the organizational structure, and so on and so forth. And of course, since the economic sphere is the sphere from which change starts, the other spheres have to cope with it. So you should have an economic theory of history. An economic theory of history which Marx tried to make, which Smith, as I showed you, tried to make, and which Schumpeter also was keen to produce. An economic history, an economic theory of history to understand the dynamism of the system and also the forces it creates endogenously and how it self-transforms. I mean, you may have periods where certain things work perfectly well, but they come to an end. And then, of course, others take over. Well, And Keynes's work, you already rightly pointed out, Schumpeter was very fond of the treatise on money, a splendid achievement, a truly Ricardian tour de force. This sounds a bit peculiar. So, I mean, as I added, there's a sting hidden in the flattery, because we all know Schumpeter was very critical of Ricardo and accused him of the Ricardian vice. I mean, making very little models and then trying to explain the world. And so it's a problem. At any rate, it will ever stand out as a landmark in this field. And the interesting thing is, I mean, when the treatise on money appeared, Schumpeter's huge work on money was obsolete. So, I mean, he said these things after he had been able to basically bury a few hundred pages of work on monetary matters, because he was in parallel working on a similar topic. So he invited Keynes to a Festschrift, and Keynes wrote that little piece, A Monetary Theory of Production. Some people consider it to be one of the most important things he had done. It is upon the invitation of Schumpeter. Okay, now what about the general theory? He wrote in a book review, 1936, in the Journal of the American Statistical Association, both its fundamental design and numerous details are just rubbish. So, a frontal assault. I mean, fundamental design, Ricardian, the book is in spirit and intent, so it is in workmanship. Surprising. Of course, there's the Ricardian vice, bold ad hoc assumptions instead of sound theory, more unknowns than equations. That is one of the accusations many of the people at the time put forward against Ricardo, but also partly against Keynes. So that is something interesting. And everywhere he really pleads for a definite policy, and on every page the ghost of that policy looks over the shoulder of the analyst, frames his assumptions, guides his pen. Basically what he says, I mean, you have a policy before you have a theory, and then you create, so to speak, a legitimation for what you are advising politicians. And you also find in Schumpeter the idea that Ricardo and Keynes were not serious scholars, but political activists, fairly used to rationalize preconceived policies. And against this, he puts his own vision. The capitalist process is essentially a process of change of the type which is being assumed away in this book. He was a finance, yes, he was a finance minister, not very successful, I must say. And he was a banker.
Yes, also
not very successful. Yes. so yes. Yeah. Well, anyway, but he after he went to he had lost his university position. He had given it up, and he was almost, I mean, gone, because he made huge losses, and he had to spend large parts of his life giving lectures for money. Lecturing for money. You see, I mean, lectures to all kinds of business people, etc., etc. Well, anyway, I should not get carried away. Innovations, he wrote, are the overwhelming fact in the economic history of capitalist society, and this is important now. Recessions and depressions do not indicate systemic failures, but express capitalist modus operandi. You see, you can only absorb innovations in terms of a critical circular. No, sorry, I have difficulties to concentrate. In terms of cycles, cyclicity is, so to speak, an important aspect of the capitalist modus operandi. And of course, he has this theory then also about long-run theory and waves, long-run waves. We would today call them growth cycles. And the point is, he accuses Keynes basically of mistaking the downturn of a Kondratiev for the whole story. If he would have taken the upturn of a Kondratiev, he would have come up with a theory of, well, everything is fine and wonderful. So you see, he's not a fool in terms of making arguments and criticizing others. So there are a couple of things that he criticizes. You can read it. I mean, it's available. The whole theoretical case, he goes on, collapses, and we are particularly left with friction or stickiness. There's one exception where Schumpeter praises Keynes, but he praises him because Keynes, Schumpeter argues, just has the same idea as he himself had already some time ago. And that is a purely monetary theory of the interest rate, right? So that is an interesting aspect, I think. But nevertheless, he continues, and this is now quite strong, the assessment. It culminates in the verdict, the less said about the last book, the better. But of course, he had not yet finished his diatribe. He adds with reference to Louis XV, Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry, instead of full employment and the maximum output, misery, shame, and a stream of blood. So, profligacy has caused the French Revolution and the guillotine. So, you see, I mean, there are certain economic ideas, very strong. You can see the bitterness also, the bitterness. The poor guy was suffering a lot. Now, Schumpeter on the essence of the Keynesian revolution, I think that is, again, a little more interesting. According to a long-standing tradition in economics, thriftiness is the main source of wealth. Saving, building up capital, productivity of labor increases because they're equipped with more capital goods, etc. Savers are the benefactors of society. This, Schumpeter now opines, is the last pillar of the bourgeois argument. The last pillar of the bourgeois argument to which even Marx fell victim, he writes. Yet Keynes sought to demolish this pillar by insisting that who tries to save destroys real capital because of a lack of effective demand, no? And via saving, the unequal distribution of income is the ultimate cause of unemployment. So there are at least ideas there which I think are interesting to think about them. Right. Okay. But channel theory, great work. No, I mean, basically all wrong. And also the channel theory is not a continuation of the treatise on money, and I think he's right in this regard. But it does not have led economics out of 150 years of error into the land of definite truth. No, it's basically an economics of secular stagnation. That is his accusation. It's not a general theory, but it's a special one, a particular one. And I've always spoken about Kondratiev. Now, he concludes, as with Marx, it is possible to admire Keynes even though one may consider his social vision to be wrong and every one of his propositions to be misleading. This is how can you, how that? No, I mean, at any rate, and of course, there was another defeat. He suffered from that a lot. I mean, when he published his business cycles, hardly anybody cared. All were into the general theory, and he was really utterly frustrated. Okay, now, some recent views about the general theory. Robert Lucas, it has nothing to do with, he's Robert Lucas Jr., you're Robert Lucas Sr., intellectually speaking. Oh, well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, Lucas, I mean, the death of Keynesian economics. So what are you doing here? You're flagging a dead horse, according to Lucas Jr. So empirical evidence shows blah, blah, blah. We have mostly full employment. So let's just get rid of the problem of Keynes. That's what he does. I mean, we have a clear labor market at every point in time. Keynesian problem, because reality shows that the actual system oscillates around a path which is fairly close to the full employment path. So this is amazing. So looked upon from this perspective, Keynes was tilting at it's a Don Quixote of economics. Not uninteresting, I think, no? And he goes on, is the general theory a great work? Of course not. How could it be? To Lucas, Keynes was no economic scientist, but again, a political activist. I think he had it from Trumpeter. And ideologue. Keynes' real contribution is not Einstein-level theory, new paradigm, all this. It is just so much hot air. Lucas, he's a Nobel laureate. Come on, you're not supposed to laugh about this gentleman. But it's getting better. Lucas writes, Keynes did not cite anyone but crazes like Hobson. We just heard about Hobson. Actually, John Maynard Keynes cited Inter alia, Bentham, Bernbauer, Castle, Edgeworth, Irving Fisher, Hansen, Harrod, Hortal, and so on and so forth. So one may wonder, what is the edition he got? Which edition did Lucas really read? No, so I'm not making this up. You see, I'm not making this up. This is so unbelievable that I'm completely perplexed. Had I known this, that I'm entering a subject in which this would be possible, I would never ever have studied it. But it's too late. It's too late. I wasted my life. So Keynes has contributed nothing of lasting substance to. Oh, sorry. Yes. To the internal mainstream of economics, that's what we researchers live on. What about you? The internal mainstream of economics, are you contributing anything of substance to it? Yeah. Well, anyway, Keynes was a political activist from beginning to end, and now it gets even better because he asks, no, first, I mean, students are laughing, etc. So, I mean, he does not protest against that. Anyway, has he successfully dethroned Keynes as the most important macroeconomist of the 20th century? That's the question he basically asked. He asked for the proper answer. Yes, Professor. Now, what is progress in economics as seen by Lucas? There are two remarks which I think are quite telling. The first one is, I see the progressive element, sorry, I read this. I am not pretending that you don't know how to read. But we should all be, so to speak, in the same line. I see the progressive element in economics as essentially technical, better mathematics, better mathematical formulation, better data process, blah, blah, blah. That's the thing, not, so to speak, ideas, concepts, connections between variables. And then he went on, and this is marvelous from my point of view. I think of all progress in economic thinking in the kind of basic core of economic theory as developing entirely as learning how to do what Hume and Smith and Ricardo wanted to do, only better. So he sees himself as a classical economist. Well, I mean, this is also Keynes. I'm sorry. Keynes calling. I mean.
But in the general theory, does distinguish neo-classical with an and-classical.
Yes, but he uses that classically in a very cavalier way, and I think it should also be forbidden. Now, as regards the mathematical part of the thing, there's a statement by von Neumann, which I think is very interesting, and I think he's a good mathematician, and. He thinks this is just rubbish. But The second thing is Lucas unconsciously, it seems, competes with Perez-Raffa in reviving the standpoint of the old classical economists. Arasi does not appear to be aware that this standpoint, as Raffa wrote, has been submerged and forgotten since the advent of the marginal method. So, I mean, it's incredible. No, it's incredible. Okay. So one can only wonder what Lucas knows about the basic core of economic theory. That is what Hume and Smith and Ricardo wanted to do. He does not care about what they actually did. He contemplates what they wanted to do. What were their intentions? What they did, of course, it's much to talk about motivations and intentions is much easier than to read and try to understand. I mean, it's the point. Here Keynes, the political activist and ideologue, there Lucas, the pure Einstein level scholar and would-be classical economic scientist. This portrait borders on ridicule. Of course, yes, it does. Okay, and of course, pride comes before the fall. I mean, Lucas was completely helpless when the crisis occurred. They couldn't say anything. Okay, so I still have, I think, about an hour. Is it?
Yes.
So now Richard Posen, another economist from Chicago, a close follower of supply-side economics for a long time, when that crisis appeared, he jotted down that the general theory, he read it, is still the best guide we have to the crisis. This meant, of course, that about 50 years lapsed without any progress, but maybe regress. And that is interesting. You see, we are inclined to think that in scientific methods, there can only be progress. There cannot be regress. That's wrong. That's wrong. There can be substantial regress. And of course, Joseph Stiglitz, much more interesting, in a commentary in The Economist very recently, John Maynard Keynes saved capitalism from itself. And then he adds that markets occasionally cannot be left to themselves. And the main argument about the neoclassical Keynesians, if I may call them that way, is that the prices change too slowly. It's a problem of speed. And therefore, governments must intervene. That is also a view held by Samuelson, of course, by Frank Hahn even, and others. So it's a question of this kind. So Keynes' ideas are obviously alive and kicking. Just look around here. He could rightly say, echoing Mark Twain, reports of my death have been largely exaggerated. Yes, it's ridiculous. Now, on the all-important principle of substitution. In the general theory, Keynes seeks to investigate the working of the economic system as a whole. It's a closed economy, that's maybe also a problem to some extent. And the focus is on the interdependence of price, quantity, and distributional magnitudes. How are they related? And the theory is meant to be general. We have already heard also about what he called the classical thing, full employment. We need not spend time on that. The key question I am addressing now, can we rely on the marginalist concept of the APS, the all-important principle of substitution? This is a term you find in Schumpeter, but similar expression also in Marshall. The all-important factor. And if not, why not? Now, we can perhaps quickly get to the principle of substitution. You're all familiar with it. And it states the demand for a factor of production, Q sub I, depends negatively on its price. If there is some unemployment, then the price will have to go down. If the price goes down, then of course the quantity supplied goes down, goes up. What is it? I'm just checking you. Come on. You're a Keynesian, so Keynesians of a particular sort, and maybe you've lost the sight of the most important fundamentals in our discipline. At any rate, the prices have to adjust. Now, this is derived from a Marshallian partial equilibrium framework based on the ceteris paribus clause. You just pointed out that Keynes was critical of that. Now, this is, of course, a case of counterfactual reasoning. What would be if wages, for example, were lower? What would be if, and so on and so forth. So it's a particular case of counterfactual reasoning. Sorry. And let's, oh, it doesn't go back. I've destroyed your wonderful machine. One page back. Oh no, that's further on. Back. Yeah, now I got it. No, don't touch it. So, if APS backs, the economy is self-equilibrating. That's the simple message. I mean, I cannot go into complications. If it does not work, it does not work when some prices are rigid, reflecting asymmetric power, for example, in the markets, the trade unions spoiling the dish, or things like that. This prevents APS to play out. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, of course, prices, while not strictly rigid, are relatively sticky. We have just come across that case. Their change is too slow and causes a lot of harm, which prompts governments to intervene. The next one is prices are flexible, but substitution opportunities are rare, are scarce, which prompts, this blocks the way towards full employment. And the fourth one is prices are flexible, and there are ample opportunities of substitution, perhaps, but there is substitution, but it does not conform to the marginless APS we have just come across. So let's see what I mean. Cases 1 and 2, neoclassicals and especially neoclassical Keynesians. Case 3, some early post-Keynesians who had not much of substitutability between the various productive inputs. Scholars studying the choice of technique problem using input-output tables nowadays. They say, well, I mean, there's one dominant technique. I mean, how could you substitute? Not possible. Case 4 is Raff et al. With regard to the phenomenon of reverse capital deepening. Now, I think Keynes is perhaps one and or two. If not, what else? You are the experts. I'm only a Raffian. Clearly, if you wish to refute APS, case 4 provides perhaps the strongest argument. Wouldn't you agree? If you want to be a proper Keynesian, you perhaps should rather take that way. Because that is, you see, that is, anyway. Okay, if it works, you know all these stories, no? With regard to the capital market and what we have with regard to reverse capital deepening is a capital supply, very difficult to define, by the way, and then a demand function. But you see, the equilibrium is unstable. Say's law in the marginalist version, it is different, by the way, from the classical version. There are various versions. I mean, if you want to be historically correct, you ought to look carefully. You have an unstable equilibrium, and that is not good for equilibrating tendencies. Okay, so Keynes discusses that, but how far does he get? I'm not sure. I don't think that Keynes's value theory is all that good to allow him to base his argument on solid ground. Now, excursus on counterfactuals. Sorry, I mean, I don't want to. I think one of the worst things one person can do to another one is to bore the other person. I don't want to bore you. Well, maybe you, but what about the others?
when they start booing or
Oh.
throwing rocks at you,
Oh, yes, yes,
we're
yes.
Brazilian, we do.
Yes, then I will
Show
then I
how
will
we-
try to be in the picture with the Spanish team.
Yeah.
Okay. Excursus and counterfactuals. This is a quotation now from a book, Libo. Scholars not infrequently assume that one aspect of the past can be changed and everything else kept constant. This is the partial equilibrium analysis, basically. Surgical counterfactuals are no more realistic than surgical airstrikes. Causes are interdependent and have important interaction effects. Even minimal rewrites of history may alter the context in such a way as to render the consequent mood or to undercut the chain of events or logic leading to it. So Keynes was a Marshallian, and he was very much, I think, tied to the ceteris paribus clause. And I think that's a serious problem of his analysis. Now, in philosophy, there have been, I'm not a philosopher, so I mean, I'm talking about a subject I know nothing about. I only have a few quotations which perhaps are of some use. In philosophy, intense discussion for over 40 years has cast doubt on the adequacy of any, now it comes, simple analysis of singular causation in terms of counterfactuals. Simple analysis of singular causation. I mean, I think marginal theory is essentially based on such an idea. A little more capital, what would happen? Slightly different preferences, what would happen? And the argument here is, in philosophy, this is maybe problematic. You ought to be very clear in which... Did you... Oh, yeah, sorry. I think I pushed it. There is a reason for that. It's not miraculous. It's not that, say, Marshall would now, I mean, say, this guy is, he should be stopped. So there's a problem. And of course, the most obvious case in which this kind of partial equilibrium analysis and the ceteris paribus clause is foolish is when you discuss a rise in real wages. When you discuss a rise in real wages, almost all people would say, yes, of course, then employment will go down. And if you reduce real wages, it will go up. That is the normal logic, and you find it across the board, basically. But is it true? Of course, I mean, a closed economy and an open economy, as you pointed out, make a difference, but we shall come to that. So if you want to ask such what-if questions, counterfactual reasoning, I think you must be aware of the fact that there are interdependencies you should not and very often could not really leave out of the picture. That is to say, you must take into account compensating price and distribution effects. And the obvious case in point I can make is Ricardo's fundamental law of distribution. Ricardo was aware of the fact that for a given system of production, actually in existence, if you change the real wage rate, the rate of profit will go down. But if the rate of profit will go down because the real wage rate you've changed higher, then of course there is a wage component in prices and there's a profit component. One goes up and the other one goes down. What is the result? And you may, in complex conditions, get the result that what comes out is not a reduction with the real wage rate increasing, a reduction in employment, but an increase. So that is something one ought to discuss. And I have an example here, but I won't bother you with this because that is too time consuming. Let me just get to that thing. An impressive case of the problematic ceteris paribus clause is an isolated change in the real wage rate. Isolated change, you can't do that. That's the point. Economists of all sorts, well, no, some not, most surely. They're on the right side, so to speak. The others are lost. Associated with rising, falling wage or falling, rising demand for labor. This need not be so. I have already given you the argument, the basic argument. Since prices depend on distribution, so does capital. Capital depends on distribution. To give the stock of capital of the system as a whole as a magnitude independently of prices and distribution is not possible. You see, it's not possible. It does not make any sense. So Lucas, in his Cambridge lectures, when he went to the University of Cambridge, I mean, he gave a paper in which he said, well, I mean, if the controversy was about whether or not capital is heterogeneous, Cambridge, UK people won the battle. As if there could ever have been a question of whether the capital stock is heterogeneous. Yes, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's again one of these kind of arguments which are completely shallow, right? Completely shallow. Of course, the capital stock is heterogeneous, but that causes a problem then, no? So, I mean, clearly enough, wages and profit components move inversely, and this now is the earth flat or round. I mean, maybe this chapter I can briefly put to you because it's about that interesting Cambridge controversy at the beginning of it, basically, but it's very interesting. So a little exercise. Take a Safin price system and take a numeraire, and then, of course, you can determine relative prices in terms of the numeraire for various constellations of R and W. You should not think, by the way, that you can move along the wage frontier and everything remains the same. It's a very stupid idea. And in Italy, some of the Srafians, I'm afraid to say, not Srafa, they were hooked. Oh. You wanted to trap me, yes. No, I mean, some Srafians really came up with the idea you can slide down the WR relationship and nothing happens. Now, I mean, if in India, for example, if in India, for example, the price for rice goes up 500%, you're not moving down, so to speak, you're creating a revolution, I suppose. So, I mean, things change. And if you have listened to Acemoglu, his Nobel laureate lectures, he has a diagram with all in utility units, strangely enough, because they are then interpersonally comparable. If he has a WR relationship, so to speak, but couched in utility terms, and he is very clear, he points out that when, I mean, we moved along and things happen, maybe all kinds of things can happen, and then he adds other differently colored curves. They come out of the blue. There is no real thing, but what he has understood, I think, that this kind of push-button economics, which we typically are exposed to, is maybe not good enough. But let me just give you this. Okay, you can now differentiate with regard to the rate of profit, the price vector, and you see here there the compensating price and distribution effects, and then of course you can have two techniques, and one is the red one and one is the blue one, and you see here they intersect twice, so there is reswitching for sure, and indeed this was shown to be possible. It was mentioned by Sraffa in one of the paragraphs towards the end of the book with regard to a system with exclusively basic products. Now, you're familiar with the concept of basic products, all of you? Who is not? Who is not? Who is not? There are many liars in this room. For sure. No, okay. A basic product is needed directly or indirectly in the production of all commodities. This is a single product model, very simplistic. Okay, you know everything. That is nice. So when Paul Samuelson was confronted with the statement by John Robinson, she had the clue from Sappho. It was not her invention, really. She had the clue from Sappho, and she said so, quite rightly. When Paul Samuelson commented on the examples provided by John Robinson and Pierre Raffa, which relate to a single non-basic commodity, only Edwin Burmeister, then was a student there at the MIT, recalled that Paul conjectured something like, I bet that cannot happen for the whole economy if it is indecomposable. That is only basic products. Not long thereafter, David Lefari produced a proof of this conjecture. He asked him, there was a student. So David Lefari proved, commas, that this was not possible in a system in which there were basic products. Okay. Now, there was the World Congress, 1965, of the Econometric Society in Rome, where Luigi Pasinetti provided a counterexample to both Lefari's proofs and Samuelson's conjecture. And he showed the proof was wrong, could not be sustained, and Burmeister recalled, now comes the nice passage, when I heard the news, I was astonished. To me, it was as if someone had established that the earth was indeed flat. So it was real. I mean, this was earth-shattering from his point of view. We were so sure that the principle of substitution works irrespective of the conditions, basically. And it doesn't. So, yes, elegant but wrong. And now, reswitching, you know this, Say's law, blah, blah, blah. What it also reveals, I think, this entire thing, if you have, and that came out because of a hint of Safa, you can have reverse capital deepening without reswitching on the wage frontier. Do I speak in Arabic or Greek? No. You all know this again. Why do you invite speakers like me who come here and then they know everything? This is unfair. Okay, good. This reveals the problematic nature of a related marginalist belief. Its advocates typically extol full price flexibility as swiftly leading the economy back into equilibrium. However, in the case under consideration, such flexibility would be a bane rather than a boon. And I think Keynes had the right idea there when he said, well, there's a problem, but he was lucky by assuming that if nominal wages fall, prices will fall accordingly, and therefore the real wage will remain constant, at least up to a point. So this challenges the view of the economy as generally a homeostatic system, endogenously activating forces that lead you back into equilibrium. So this was the debate in capital theory. The results of the debate amongst the combatants, amongst the people involved, including Samuelson, Lefari, but also Burmeister, yes, tutti quanti, are the following. Reswitching is possible with regard to the economic system as a whole. It's not limited to just some sectors, the system as a whole, or technique as it is called. Samuelson's conjecture that this presupposes a decomposable matrix and Lefari's attempt to prove it are wrong. They agreed, all the people that were involved. Secondly, reswitching on the wage frontier involves, of course, reverse capital deepening, but the reverse capital deepening does not presuppose reswitching on the frontier. What is important for a criticism of neoclassical theory is exclusively, you might say, with some exaggeration, reverse capital deepening. And assumptions ruling out reswitching exist, but they are highly restricted. They agreed upon that. I mean, there are documents which make that very clear. And so this is the case in which you have lots of reverse capital deepening cases without the switching on the frontier. I will not talk more about it. Now, the implications of this, you might ask yourself, what are the implications? I mean, in the history of our subject, there has been hardly any theory which was not eventually, up to a point, to a certain extent, debunked. It's not true that, I mean, so to speak, economics is a subject that moves always forward, leaving out all the behind the errors and only collecting what is good, like in that fairy tale. You know, the what is it? What's the fairy tale?
We don't know that one.
Well, the German title is Aschenputtel. I mean, there are the pigeons eating the bad stuff, and the rest goes into the bucket. So anyway, so there is one aspect. Schumpeter, in his presidential address 1948 to the American Economic Association, entitled "Science and Ideology," recommend that piece. Read it. Drew the attention to the vision or ideology authors to have that motivates and guides their research when they start doing their research. Such visions may be shaped by the dominant intellectual environment, blah, blah, blah. And he warns people that it would be a grave mistake to expect the ideological element go away completely, even in the course of the work. Of course, I mean, if you're completely contradicted by what you find out empirically or theoretically, then you would change your point of view. But there are cases in which there is a contradiction, and yet somehow the pre-scientific vision guides you nevertheless, and you don't stop using your model. And I think that is the case in neoclassicism. They have a vision of the system, and the reswitching and reversing debate could not fundamentally change that. They continue. And of course, that throws up an even deeper question. Here, Salvadori is working on it right now. That is the question, what is the relationship between theory and meta-theory? An important issue, at any rate. So theory and meta-theory, and even Keynes, if you change the interest rate and you have investment projects, you might find that, I mean, the marginal efficiency of capital function is also falling victim to the partial equilibrium approach, which does not take into account, I mean, compensating effects. I think I should stop here. This you need not care much about, but yes, well, I apologize for my propensity to talk basically forever, but but I see that this is maybe not the audience that would like that too much. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Heinz, as usual. A great presentation. The PT, you had, I saw all the things. I should have asked you to come more days because I have a lot of interesting materials. Now, I think there are a few questions. I look at, people are looking. If contradicting your view, you know, people want to ask a question, it means that they found this stuff interesting. Yes, that's the point we brought you here. That's why we know everything, but we wanted to confront you. It was not to learn from you, it was to question you. Now, I see you. Anybody else for the first round? Gallo? Okay, my capacity to think is very limited, so there will be a round of three, which is first Tom, then Ettore, then you in green. I don't know your name, unfortunately. Please tell your name and where are you from when you answer.
Hi, Tom Pally. I'm going to direct my questions to Heinz. Sorry to the other two authors, but it was very, very entertaining and very enjoyable. That will depend on how you answer my question. It was interesting, but it was fun to hear all about Schumpeter's critique of Keynes. But I just parenthetically observe that Keynes was not so kind to Marx in the general theory. There's a throwaway paragraph where he said it's complete junk and I've learned nothing from him or something like that. Okay, now here's my deep question to you, and it's probably our difference here. I couldn't help but dig out a quote from Robert Solow on Friedman, which goes, "Another difference between Milton and myself is that everything reminds Milton of the money supply. Well, everything reminds me of sex, but I keep it out of my papers." And, you know, when it comes to these conversations, it seems to be that everything reminds Sraffians of reverse switching. and you're absolutely right. There is something about reverse switching. I'm not going to argue about it. But is it the essence of the general theory and the Keynesian problem? I think Keynes was not wanting to change the technique of production. He was thinking about a world in which the technique was given. That was the ceteris paribus. And then what was short was aggregate demand, and he wanted to throw more aggregate demand on that system, which had a year before shown that it was capable of producing such output, but there had been a falling off of aggregate demand. So I really do think that there's the Friedman Solow Sraffian says something there. And then that leads me to mind that you rather flippantly and very real said there are only two types of economists, those who are right and those who are wrong. And so just those, well, I think you used the word those who are right and those who are wrong. Okay, well, how do you know when you know economics? Who should I ask?
I wouldn't invite anybody who didn't know economics. You haven't finished.
When I was there's a reverse. Okay, when I was on the party committee at the Hall of Graduate Studies at Yale, the committee had two rules. Rule number one is that you live by the rules, and rule number two is I make the rules.
You just describe the grupo de economia política of.
Well, at Regallo, I have a question for Matias about Keynes not being on the conflict side of the economic thought. I mean, personally, I think Keynes was very mindful about his position. Am I a liberal in 1925? I think he essentially says, I am in class war. You will always find me on the side of the educated bourgeoisie. So, and I mean, most people usually tend to become more conservative as they age. And I think you showed us that Keynes did the opposite. So my question is, what's your take? Why that happened? Is because Keynes, well, let's say, was mindful of the necessity of a class compromise, or because probably part of the educated bourgeoisie that he knew turned to fascism in the late 30s and 40s. And a question to Heinz Kurz about what can we say of Schumpeter in the end? So is my idea will be that the only thing that we can say of Schumpeter is the idea that technological progress is kind of deterministic and can be modeled as a logistic function, as Goodwin as Goodwin did. So is this idea something that you will tend to agree with, or shall we throw this out as well?
Thank you. My name is Natalia Flores. Thank you very much for that wonderful panel. My institution. I work at Ideas. Yes. So thank you very much. It was amazing. Thank you. I think this might be the final day for me, but I have enjoyed it very much. And for what especially this last panel, I really enjoyed it. And because I enjoy when we as economists ask those questions, right? How do we make a better science? How do we make a science that is more relevant, that it deals with these very complicated questions about ideology and about methodology and method and all of that? So I don't know if I'm sorry or I'm proud to be that feminist in the room, but I just wanted to say that it is very important to also engage with the critiques that feminist economists have been making, especially considering that, for example, the concept of employment or equilibrium, we will need to rethink that if we consider these very valuable insights of feminist economists about the reproductive sphere of the economy, right? So just a comment, because if we want to have a relevant discipline today, I think we need to engage with gender relations in the economy. Thank you.
So we're doing this. Nobody asked you yet, so begin.
So to reiterate, yes, I think you're right that Keynes moves and becomes more. I think that the theoretical change, his policies are the same. So by the way, he says by the time he gets the Bank of England, he is in the Treasury during the First World War, and he becomes a pariah politically after 1919, and he only comes back with the war. So the two people that were pariahs, Churchill and Keynes, come back and they basically manage the politics and the economics. And he comes back and he says to his mom that he's now they bring him to the Bank of England as one of the directors, one of the court. It's British have complicated names and things for, but it's but he says he's a new bishop in a new church. So he knows he won because the policies he won in many ways. And so I think the class part is that Keynes was a product of what he was, Eton and Cambridge and the apostles and an elitist, and he abhorred, the working class, even aesthetically, So I think that those things were not him, He didn't think, to say something very Brazilian, he didn't think the masses could eat the fine biscuit that he ate, hoje. A massa ainda comerá o biscoito fino que fabrico. It was impossible, sorry for the... so I think that's it. He was an elitist, and I think he voted with his feet. He never went to labor. To Natalia, very briefly for your comment, which is important. I think that the conflict, we didn't necessarily discuss those issues, but I think that the conflict tradition opens up exactly a window to discuss the issues that it's more, it allows a more interesting understanding of feminism. I mean, you can be a feminist and a neoclassical economist, you can be a feminist and a political economist. And I think that the conflict tradition and Keynesian economics, Keynes' contributions to his, giving up or trying to, at least on some level, of the idea of Seth's law is a more fruitful sort of perspective dealing with those issues.
Okay, and Tom, Solo and Friedman, yes, I know this quotation, but your argument about Keynes' techniques are given. No. No. I mean, technical knowledge is given, but if it's very short run, of course, you can't do much about it. I mean, you can either close down plant and equipment or you use it. But it's not given in the long period. And of course, I mean, if you want to discuss the issues Keynes really was interested in, they cannot be just ultra short, not possible. And he had technical alternatives. You see, even with regard to the marginal efficiency of capital, you must somehow move down a production function. If you move down a production function, if you consider the production function is made up of linear techniques, you change them. Of course, you change them. And even if you do not change this, even if you do not change this, I mean, if you change the degree of utilization of machinery, you change technique. Oh, come on. I mean, he talked about facts. I think he thought, I mean, they could be captured in the way he discussed them. No, I don't think you can. If you argue that Keynes even had the technique given, then he would be even more narrow than I would accuse him of. No, so okay, that's one thing. Well, we need not agree, but you're right. I mean, the Sraffians, they are obsessed, of course, with the truth. They are obsessed with the truth, and the possibility of reverse capital deepening and reswitching has been shown. Period. The fact that people believe they can ignore it, that's a problem. And you might wish to think, what kind of analysis would you then put in place of marginalism? I mean, it's the kind of analysis you people are doing, where you talk about effective demand and all that. No, I mean, it's not. I mean, marginal utility of apples and marginal utility of no. I mean, I think that's the point. It opens the way. If Say's law is gone, then you need to somehow fill the degree of freedom that is turning up, and that's one thing. And now let me come to Schumpeter very quickly. You see, Schumpeter was very critical of Keynes for, I think, not only, but essentially these reasons of rivalry. I mean, there was this guy everywhere. I mean, and me. Absolutely, yes. Yes. I mean, the business cycles, the business. He wanted to go. He wanted to go to Yale. I mean, he wanted to leave his university. No, he was utterly. You might, the youngsters amongst you, you might say pissed off. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't use such rude words.
Started a rumor at the first publication, which cited the paper, but the first encounter of the very conservative idea that Keynes is short run because he's childless is a Schumpeter.
Yes, also, yes. Well, anyway, but what I wanted to say, if you have a system in which new technology, I mean, innovations, create turmoil all the time, you do not have such an equilibrating process at hand. And if money is credit is so important in Schumpeter, you create new capacities to demand things. So I think Schumpeter basically did not believe in Say's law. Of course not. How could you? So I think that is one thing. Now, what is the major idea of Schumpeter? I think Schumpeter, like Smith, in a sense, and I was very puzzled when I came across such similarities. He was in particular interested in destroying false ideas in economics, because false ideas, to the extent to which, in particular, they lead your actions, they create a lot of damage. So it was an educational project. I mean, false ideas are a problem, and his criticism of Marx was that, I mean, some of his people, even Marx, I mean, they circulated false ideas in a variety of respects. He basically, I mean, turned, so to speak, the table around. That's the point. So he thought highly of him, but he felt that he had produced arguments from certain observations which he thought were correct, which were misleading. So this is the basic thing. And if you do not fall victim to false ideas, then of course economically you also succeed much better than if you're running after misleading concepts, etc., etc. I think that's the basic thing. So what else is there in Schumpeter? You see, I must confess, I mean, I founded the Graz Schumpeter Center because when I got there, I thought, I mean, come on, there are all these business economists and they don't know that in a few years' time, I mean, Schumpeter will be the great hero of their discipline. So I said, I mean, I capitalize on it and I could do things which I otherwise could not have done. So very simple. I'm an optimist in this regard. I mean, I want to get resources channeled in the right directions. And occasionally you do have to make some compromises. But then I started to read Schumpeter more carefully. And whenever I disagree with him, I learn something. You see, that's the point. I mean, he is an interesting author because he is such an, not personally aggressive, but aggressive person, thinker. He thinks about things and he tries to think them the other way around. And of course, I mean, he is right as regards the importance of innovations. There is no doubt about this. The capitalist system, and Marx, of course, relied on capitalism's capacity to increase labor productivity and improve the situation so that eventually socialism could take over in the land of cocaine. No? Yeah, you think cocaine means what you think, but you're wrong. Yeah. Cocaine here means something else. No, it's not, you know? Anyway. Anyway, no, I mean, that would be my answer. I mean, many of his ideas are wrong, but what he writes, for example, about democracy, what he writes about capitalism destroying family and culture, he's very critical of it. He's not just an advocate of capitalism. No, I mean, read him and criticize him. As regards gender questions, in Schumpeter, no, there are not many ideas to be found, nor, I'm afraid to say, in Keynes. But I do not dispute the importance of what he said. But in these authors, it's not there. You could, of course, ask yourself a what-if question, counterfactual reasoning. What would Keynes have said had he come across that question? But no, I don't dispute that in the least, not at all. But you see, I cannot read into Keynes what there isn't. Sorry, thanks very much.
Thank you. Now, I believe we can have a 2-minute break for 3 more hours, or maybe stop now because our guests are a bit tired. So everybody can bombard them with questions, but the session elsewhere, and we need to restore the liquidity of our own systems. So I would like to thank everybody for a great session.